This is another one of my exciting grungy junk journals that also has a thrilling story to follow within its pages. Hi everyone, Patti here. I'm so happy with the way this wonderful steampunk journal turned out with my granddaughter's drawings and artwork throughout. This was truly a family effort. So many writing spaces and hidden pockets highlighted by beautiful trim, handmade and vintage ephemera. The chains, gears, and story bring this one-of-a-kind steampunk journal to life and make it a true item of desire. Rather as a gift or for personal use, this would make a fantastic treasure to add to your collection. Marcy rolls over in bed, and her eyes focus on the ceiling, which seems strangely calm. The motion that she has felt from the ship has stopped. This must mean that they are at anchor. She jumps out of bed and runs to the main deck. What a wonderful sight! Land after so many days. She sees the lush green island that she has desperately been seeking. There is a sudden shrill behind her. It is Diane, her best friend, who realizes that they have reached their destination also, followed by another outcry of wonder as her sister joins the two. They hug one another as they realize the island. Marcy, Diana, and Stacy set out on their voyage over 3 weeks ago, and through high winds, rough seas, and even some seasickness, finally the calm of a harbor. When they left London over 3 weeks ago in search of this island, it seemed like not much more than a dream. Now it is all too real as they hear the captain's ringing voice. "You girls, get your gear together. It's time to depart." They all go to their cabins and pack their gear and head back to the main deck. The crew is busy unloading the supplies of grain, salt, and whiskey as many of the islander boats head toward the ship. The captain is talking to one of the islanders and motions to the girls. "Here's your ride. This is Big Eddie. He will be taking you to the beach. He will set you up with everything you need, but be careful and don't let him overcharge you." They all get into the skiff and head to shore. When they arrive at shore, there isn't much town, just a little store, a bait shop, and several huts that the islanders live in. Marcy looks at Big Eddie, wonders how he got his name. Big Eddie is probably a 50 to 60-year-old islander who seems to have been here all of his life. As she and Big Eddie start to talk, she explains to him that she will need a guide, horses, packed mules, and food and supplies for at least 2 weeks. Big Eddie looks at her puzzled and asks, "Where are you going for 2 weeks on this little island?" "We are headed to the Tonga jungle." She no more than gets the words out of her mouth when Big Eddie burst into laughter. His words roar with amusement. The Treasure of Tonga Island. As he laughs uncontrollably, her mind flashes back to 4 weeks ago when Marcy's father scolds her once again. "Marcy, this is the 4th school that you have dropped out of." Diana and Stacy are hiding in the next room as they also have followed Marcy's lead in dropping out of school. Her father tells her, "This is the last straw. You will no longer be allowed to live the carefree existence of no commitment. It's time that your mother and I take some control of you and your sister's future. You will be going to the Darlin Finishing School, where both of your new careers will be finding a husband that I find suitable." "Father, you can't be serious. That is not the life for me nor Stacy." "Oh, but I am very serious. Your friend Diana has had too much influence on you, and the 3 of you will soon be old maids with no prospects." "Father, I'm barely 22 years old. Diane is the same, and Stacy is just a year younger." "I'm sorry, but this is how it must be. If you refuse to follow my demands, you and your sister will be financially cut off." Diana and Stacy look at each other in shock and wonder what they will do, as they hear Marcy yell, "This is not the way it will be," and storms out of the room. The 3 of them head to Marcy's bedroom. Marcy is overwhelmed as she says, "I think we've pushed our luck too far this time." Stacy says, "What will become of us?" Diana says, "There's no way someone your father finds acceptable is someone that I would be willing to spend a day with, let alone the rest of my life." Marcy says, "Well, it's time to act on what we've been talking about. Where is the map?" Stacy says, "No, you can't be serious." Diana says, "Oh yes, it is time." Marcy pulls the map out from underneath her mattress. As they open the map, it reveals the whereabouts of the Treasure of Tonga Island. With that, Marcy comes back into focus as she hears Big Eddie, another treasure seeker, and this time 3 women. This should go well. Big Eddie begins to lay out what he thinks they will need for supplies. Marcy and Diana negotiate back and forth with some laughter and some yelling. Finally, they seem to come together at a price. All this time, a local guide, Jim Tanner, has been sitting and quietly listening as Big Eddie goes back to the store to begin to put together the supply list. Jim Tanner approaches the 3 women. All 3 women stare at him in different ways. Stacy's overwhelmed as she sees his 6'3" muscular frame. His rugged good looks make her shiver with excitement. Diana says, "What's a good-looking stud like you doing so far from home?" Marcy says to him, "Your accent gives you away. You are obviously from England." Jim fires back, "Close, young lady. Australia." Marcy says, "I suppose you are the local guide." Jim says, "I know the island like the back of my hand. Been here for 5 years. Diana asks, "How good of a guide are you? 5 years. Did you get lost?" Jim says, "I'm not too welcome back at home. But on the other hand, here I am very well liked." And Diana and Marcy, with the same breath, "At what price?" Jim says, "It is hard to put a value on someone that not only knows the rugged terrain, but also all the dangers that await." With this last remark, a sense of reality sets in on all 3 girls. "What danger awaits us?" Marcy asks, "and just what will we be facing?" Jim says, "The island is filled with everything from bandits to wild animals, with little to no law, and for certainty one must be willing to protect oneself." With this, Marcy and Diana begin another negotiation, this time with Jim Tanner. Not only on cost, they ask, "What kind of protection are we talking about?" Jim explains to them that they will be needing at least 2 more extra hands and supplies for them and their animals. At this moment, Marcy takes control of the conversation. "Jim, while you are certainly nice to look at, aren't we getting a little ahead of ourselves? Not only have we not heard any kind of fee, but we have heard no qualifications. We are not looking for a model, we are looking for a guide." At this time, Jim pulls a large hunting knife from his side. The sun glistens down its long blade. Jim swiftly turns and throws the knife at a tree 20 feet away, sinking its blade right in the middle of the tree. As he turns with a big smile on his face, Diana says, "Nice trick, but now you have no knife like the one I have." And Jim looks down, staring at a rather large machete firmly between his legs. And he says, "Young lady, I certainly hope you know how to use that." And Marcy chuckles. "Oh, she does." Jim with a slight smile and a bit of quiver in his voice. This should set the right tone for negotiations. Marcy says, "Well, let's first talk about your fee." Jim says, "From what I've heard, we're on another treasure hunting expedition, and the chances of us finding something leaves me with little desire to settle for a percentage of what we find for my fee." Diana says, "Be careful with that. That might come back to bite you." Jim says, "My flat fee is usually $20 a day, and all expenses, with a small bonus if everything goes smoothly." Marcy then replies, "I'll give you $25 a day, all expenses, and a large bonus if everything goes smoothly." Stacy says, "I certainly hope everything goes smoothly." Diana says, "It better." Jim says, "Okay, ladies, these are the supplies we're going to need." Then Jim goes over the list of items. A horse for each member, a pack animal for each member, 2 more pack animals for extra gear, a revolver for each member of the party, and Stacy chirps in, "A revolver? You mean a gun? I've never shot a gun." Jim says, "Well, I hope you don't have to, but you do have to have one. We will also need a long gun for me, and the 2 runners will need a shotgun." Jim then goes on, "We will need ammunition for all the guns and some extra just in case. Let's go talk to Big Eddie and tell him how much more we need to add." They negotiate back and forth for a while and finally come to an agreement on a price for everything they need. Marcy seems to be relieved and pulls out a pouch and spills out several gold coins to pay the bill. Big Eddie and Jim both grab Marcy by the arm and pull her aside. "Never flash gold again like this. You've just made our journey a very dangerous one." Big Eddie turns and goes to make sure the supplies are being made ready. Jim looks at Marcy and says, "This is where this expedition gets real. You must start watching what you are doing. Marcy is stunned between being mad and being scared. Her mind flashes back once again to her father. This time she is somewhat younger, at the age of 15, and a traveling band of merchants have found their way onto her father's estate. They are selling all kinds of wonders that they claim are from around the world. One of these wonders is a scarf that the merchant says was hand-woven in Morocco from the most desirable silk from China. He claims that the scarf has value beyond measure, but he would be willing to trade it for the necklace around her neck. As she reaches for her necklace, she feels her father's grip upon her wrist. "Marcy, what are you doing? Do you really believe that the necklace that you know is so valuable is something that you should trade for a scarf that you know nothing about?" Her father's gaze abruptly turns to the merchant. "I don't know how you got onto my estate, but you have 5 minutes to get off." As the merchant stares back, trying to decide what he's going to do, 4 of her father's workers step up and say, "This way, sir." The merchant turns and leaves without saying a word. "Marcy, you must be more careful than this. I will not always be there. You must learn to be able to handle a situation correctly and never put yourself in danger." Jim's sudden words, "Marcy, Marcy," bring her back to the present. "Yes, I know I need to be more careful. I wasn't thinking." Jim prepares a hut for the women for the evening, and they will begin their journey at first light. As the 3 of them are in the hut going through the preparing their gear, they hear "Is anybody hungry?" Stacy sticks her head out of the hut and says, "I am famished." Jim says with a smile, "This way, my dear." Stacy takes his hand and starts off for the fire, with Marcy and Diana right behind. As they approach the fire, they are surprised to see not only Big Eddie and his crew, but many women and children. They are all sitting around several large tables with the fire in the middle. The tables are filled with many different dishes. It looks like rice, vegetables, and meat. After 3 weeks on the ship with the same nothing to eat, this looks like a feast to rival any fancy restaurant in London. As they all sit and begin to take from the bowls passed around, it is apparent what the vegetables and grains are, but they are almost afraid to ask what the meat is. Jim and Big Eddie laugh at the same time. "It's just a bird like chicken, my dear." As they begin to eat, there's a bottle being passed around. It's handed to Stacy, and before she can grasp it, Jim pulls it from her hands and tells her, "You don't want to taste this, young lady?" Big Eddie, laughing, says, "This is very strong drink. It makes moonshine taste like water." Stacy says, "But I want to try it." And Marcy and Diana say, "Just a sip." Jim tells them, "It is your decision, but don't blame me if you aren't awake in the morning." All 3 of them decide to take a sip, and Stacy says, "This tastes like kerosene." Marcy says, "It is a bit strong, isn't it?" Diana asks where she can get a bottle to take with them. They finish their meal and turn in to be able to get an early start. As the sun appears over the horizon and shimmers through the cracks of the hut, Stacy's head is a bit wobbly. Marcy says, "Not a good way to start," and Diana says, "It helped me sleep well. I feel great." The 3 gather their gear and head out of the hut. Jim has already gotten the gear packed with the runner's help and are prepared to leave. As they leave the village, many of the women have concerns on their faces, and Big Eddie says to them, "You 3 be safe and stay close to Jim." They begin out on their journey from the village through what seems to be a fairly decent trail. The sun is now fully risen, and it appears it is going to be a very hot day. One of the runners takes the lead while the other brings up the rear. It is very clear from the beginning that Jim is skilled at his job. He is constantly aware of his surroundings as he heads them towards the first marker of the map, the palm trees. Marcy and Jim had talked about how much she would reveal of the map as they went. As they approached the watering hole in the midst of the palm trees, Marcy takes Jim's hand and leads him off by themselves. "So, Jim, the palm trees are the first stopping point on our map," and she reveals the map folded. "It appears that our next spot is this mountain pass here in the middle of the island. Is this how it looks to you also?" "Well, Marcy," Jim says, "if I could see the whole map, it would be easier for me to plan our route." And Marcy says, "What would you need of me?" Jim says, "Well, Marcy, this is not my first expedition in leading people in search of the Tonga treasure, but this is the first route that takes us this way, and if we are headed towards the deciduous forest, this would be the best way." They all unpack and settle in for the night and plan to get a fresh start in the morning. As everyone is finishing dinner and heading to their tents, Diana says to Jim, "It could get cold tonight." And Jim says, "Wait till tomorrow in the mountain pass, and you will find out what the cold is." Next morning, Stacy says to Jim, "Is there any place to wash up before we head out?" Jim says, "There is a small pond up and around that hill." The three girls head up to the pond to wash up before they leave. As the girls find the pond, it's much more than that. There's a beautiful runoff waterfall making for a lovely large pond and a beautiful natural setting. As the girls giggle with glee, leaving their inhibitions aside, they dive into the pond, splashing one another and getting lost in the moment. Back at the camp, Jim was ready to go for the better part of an hour. He decides to walk up to the pond and tell the girls it's time to go. As he approaches the pond, he hears the laughter and splashing from the three young ladies. Stacy sees him and yells out, "Stay there! We don't have any clothes on." Stacy and Marcy tell him, "We can't get out of the water. Our clothes are over there on the bank." Jim says, "Well, I'll bring them to you." Stacy says, "No, you can't come that close." With that, Diana steps up and calmly walks out of the water and picks up their clothes. Her glistening body turns and walks back to the pond. Not sure if Jim, Stacy, or Marcy is the most embarrassed, but Diana is unfazed. Jim, with a bit of quiver in his voice, says, "See you back at camp. We're burning light." As the three girls come back to camp, Stacy and Marcy say, "We're ready to go." Diana looks at Jim and asks him if he is okay. Jim answers back, "Just fine, young lady." As they mount the horses and begin up the trail, they can tell that not only is the weather changing very rapidly, getting much cooler, but it seems they're going uphill at a very fast rate. Jim says, "There is a clearing up ahead. We will rest the horses and break out warmer gear." We could actually see some snow. As they approach the pass, the wind picks up, and as they begin to enter the pass, it does start snowing. By the time they reach the top of the pass, they are in full-blown blizzard. Jim and the runners tie all the horses together and keep everyone in a very tight formation. As they come down out of the pass, the wind and snow stopped as suddenly as it started. With each passing step, the weather turns warmer and warmer. Jim stops at the bottom of the pass and lets everyone take off their warm gear. The next part of this journey is going to the deciduous forest, which leads through some hilly areas where they must watch out for rock slides. So they began their journey to the deciduous forest. It seems that in the whole area the sky is full of birds. Marcy asked Jim, "What is with all the birds?" Jim says, "This is their nesting and mating area. But this is also a very heavily populated area of all kinds of beasts that do their hunting and killing. We must also watch out for poachers." As they continue down the trail, Jim yells, "Ride! Ride fast!" As their horses begin to gallop down the trail, they look back with a cloud of dust behind them. After they gallop a short way, Jim tells them to stop. Marcy asks, "What is wrong?" At the same time, Stacy yells out, "The two runners are gone!" Jim says, "I don't know if it was an accident or intentionally, but we have lost our two runners and our pack animals." Diana jumps off her horse and yells at Jim, "What's going on?" "I don't know, but I saw someone up on the hills who started the rock slide. Rather they were trying to kill us or separate us. We are separated. The best thing we can do is to gather up what we have and continue quickly." But Stacy says, "What of the runners? What of the animals?" Jim says, "I'm sorry, but look back at that trail." The trail was completely covered with rocks and dirt from the slide. So rather if the runners were part of it or just caught in it, they are gone. We have a few more miles to go to reach the deciduous forest where we will be much safer. As they ride into the forest, Jim leads them to a small meadow in the trees. Marcy and Stacy look exhausted and afraid. Diana takes her machete and puts it into her pack and pulls out her sidearm and straps it to her waist. "This might come in much handier," she says. Jim turns and looks at Marcy and Stacy. "You both need to do the same. We need to prepare for everything." As Jim puts on his sidearm, he pulls the long rifle from its pack and slips it into the sleeve onto his saddle. He then pulls the shotgun from the pack and hands it to Diana and tells her to put it on her saddle. Diana says, "My thoughts exactly." Jim says we're going to push on a bit further before we camp for the night. He shows the girls on his map a clearing 5 or so miles ahead and tells them he will meet them there in a couple of hours. Marcy says, "What do you mean? You're leaving us?" Stacy yells out, "You can't leave us!" Diana chirps in, "He's going back to make sure we aren't being followed." Jim says, "That is right. I'll see you in a couple of hours," and he heads out. Diana mounts her horse and tells the other 2 girls, "Time to toughen up, ladies, and if you have to use those guns, make sure what direction they're pointed in." The ride is slow and winding through the forest. Every noise seems to be someone hiding behind the trees. Every crack of a twig is someone waiting to pounce. Diana chuckles out loud, "Toughen up, ladies," and spurs her horse into the lead. As they approach the clearing, it seems that Jim has led them to a well-defensible position. There are not only large rocks for them and the horses to hide around, but you can see anyone coming in all directions. As they unpack some of their gear to set up camp, they find the pack animal they have does not have their belongings, but it does have some food and water, so they are thankful for that. Stacy begins to build a fire, and Diana stops her and says, "Let's not make ourselves an easy target." Marcy says, "It's plenty warm enough. We will be fine until Jim finds us." As the 3 sit and try to remain calm, a snapping of a twig behind them, and Jim has found them. Jim says, "I see no one following us, so perhaps it's time to look at the whole map and decide what direction we'll finish this journey." The 3 girls look at one another, and Marcy tells Jim, "Yes, it is time to trust one another." Marcy unfolds the map, and the final destination is the thick jungle of Tonga. Jim looks at her and says, "You might have told me this to begin with. This jungle is all but impenetrable." Stacy says, "We're stuck? We aren't going no further?" Diana says, "What good is a map if it doesn't lead anywhere?" Marcy says, "This is where it is time for me to tell you where I got the map." Marcy then tells her story. 50 years ago, my father and uncle were just coming out of the war and leaving their military service behind them. They had acquired a clipper ship with the intentions of making their fortune in spices and silks. Marcy explains their plan, buying them on the island and selling them in London. While father did just this and turned his travels into a small fortune, my uncle was just beginning his adventures in the islands. About 5 years later, my uncle came to me and said, "We have always been 2 of a kind, always looking for adventures and never being able to conform to society." He said, "I can never return to Tonga Island because what I'm about to give you costs not only money but also lives." He explains this is the real map to the treasure of the Tonga jungle. When your father and I went our separate ways, I returned to Tonga Island and had become quite good friends with one of the islanders that had lived his whole life there. His name was Sir Randolph. He had been named after an early English explorer. I quickly became part of his family, his wife, and all 12 of his kids. He would tell us stories on how the Englishman he had been named after had buried the treasure deep in the island. The legend of the treasure has been told over and over through the years. While I was there, trouble began to brew between the islanders and the sailors that would frequent the island. One evening, our home was attacked by some of these sailors, and a gun battle began as we were forced to protect our homestead. We managed to protect the family and the homestead, but my friend Randolph had been seriously injured. Calling to me from his bedside, he knew that he would not last and made me promise to take care of his family. He handed me a folded piece of paper, and I unfolded it, revealing a treasure map. I said, "Randolph, what is this?" "This is the true treasure map. I've seen the treasure with my own eyes." With that, he was gone. I stuck the map inside my coat, not knowing what to think about all the events that had just occurred. The next morning, I awoke to shots. Several runners from the town said there were soldiers arriving in the harbor. I had been told that there was a warrant put out for my arrest for the incident of the sailors attacking and us defending our home. Several sailors had been killed. I gathered Randolph's family together and told them, "We must take our leave from this place to one of the other islands or possibly back to England." Randolph's wife and older son told me, It was impossible to go to England, that this was their home and they would be safe on the other side of the island. After much conversation, they convinced me that I should leave and come back when it was safe. I made plans to return to England, and upon arriving and learned that Tonga Island was put under the rule of Spain, and that I had a warrant out for me in Spain and on the island and would never be able to return. Marcy, you know I'm older than your father, and will never be able to set out on another adventure. But if you decide you must break away, hopefully this map will lead you to that adventure. But one thing you must promise me is that you will find the Randolph family and pay them back for all that I could not. Jim says, sounds like a good story. Best one I've heard on the treasure. Hope it's true. We will have a cold camp tonight and no fire, and we will get started in the morning. Now Jim had much more detail about where they were heading, and wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The trail from the forest to the jungle was once again through small valleys and hills. Okay, girls, keep your eyes open. We don't want to be caught in another rock slide. They journeyed for a few hours, and suddenly around the bend they went from a deciduous forest to almost a hilly desert, and now before them was a lush jungle. There were many markers, and it seemed that the map was incredibly detailed. They made their way through the jungle where they came upon a mid-sized river and followed it downstream where it came to a pooling area, and where the water seemed to glisten almost as clear as the blue sea. This is where the map said the treasure is. The fourth pool to the west. There's an underground cavern that you must swim to find the treasure. With this, Jim says, wait a minute, and steps back into the jungle. Stacy says, what is it? Diana puts her hand over Stacy's mouth, and Jim grabs Marcy. Jim says, there's someone out there. As they stand still, they see a croc slither into the water. Jim says with a chuckle, oh, it's not one of the bad guys, it's just a croc. All three girls almost in unison say, I'm not getting in that water. Jim says, ladies, don't worry. Where I'm from down under, he's just a baby. Jim strips his shirt and boots and grabs a knife to put around his waist. Diana grabs his arm and says, that little thing isn't going to help you, and she straps her machete around his waist. Jim says, good call, girl. Feel much safer already. With that, he turns and dives into the water, and he's gone. The girls look mesmerized for a moment, and then take the animals and move back into the jungle. It seems forever when suddenly there's a rolling and a commotion in the water, and then nothing. They look at one another, and Stacy asks, what shall we do? Marcy says, exactly what we have been doing. Wait. It seems close to an hour, maybe longer, when suddenly Jim's head emerges from the depth of the pond. He comes out, and he has a large wrapped leather bundle with him. All the girls ask him, what happened? Without going into much detail, Diana stops him and says, where is my machete? And Jim says, the croc had more use for it than I did. Marcy hardly could control herself and said, I'm so thankful to see you. What about this? Isn't this what we are after? Stacy and Diana grab the leather pouch from him, and Marcy says, no, you are much more important. They cut the leather pouch open. There are two large wooden chests inside as they break open the lock on one side. It is full of papers, maps, and charts inside, and a small pouch. They turn to the other box and force it open. There are a few gold doubloons, some silver, and another assortment of charts and maps. Jim says, well, there might be enough gold and silver here to pay for our adventure, but little more. Diana turns around, beaming with her smile from one corner to the other. She opens the pouch that was her chest and pours out 70 to 80 pearls the size of her thumb. Marcy, Jim, and Stacy, their eyes beaming wide open. Diana says, this might be worth just a little more. And Jim says, juggling by the size and the color of these pearls, yes, I would say millions. As they all grab one another and hug one another. Now, what Marcy says, Jim echoes. We can't stay on the island because once this gets out, we will either have this taken from us or our throats slit. Diana and Marcy both say, we can't go back to England. Spain and England have too strong of a treaty. Jim says, I can't go to Australia or New Zealand, where I'll be spending several decades in prison. Stacy speaks up, not being the most sensible one or the most adventurous. Well, that leaves us one choice. There is a new little place called America. They all agree that it is the best spot for them to head for the foreseeable future. Jim says, "We will go back on the east side of the island and arrange for Big Eddie to book us passage to North America." As they begin to load up their animals, Marcy walks over to Jim and says, "Does this work for you, too? Is this what you would want to do?" Jim turns around and grabs Marcy by the arm. "We can figure out what we want to do with the pearls on our trip, but there's only one treasure I'm not leaving without, and that is you, Marcy." They both hugged as Stacy and Diana applauded in total approval. They head back to the village and Jim sneaks in to talk to Big Eddie, and they arrange for passage to a ship that will lead them to North America. He goes and retrieves the three girls, and Big Eddie takes them down to the shore where they can load into a skiff, where they can begin their journey to the Americas. Jim, Stacy, and Diana thank Big Eddie for all of his help. Marcy grabs him and gives him a hug and sticks a pouch in his hand with 10 pearls in it. "Big Eddie, your father was Randolph, Sir Randolph." Big Eddie says with surprise in his eyes, "I know who my father was." And Marcy says, "He was my uncle's best friend, and I'm fulfilling a promise that the two of them had together." With that, Marcy gives him a kiss on the cheek, and they are off in the skiff. They load onto the ship, and it begins to set sail out of the harbor. The four of them, with the wind in their face and the sun on their back, are all thrilled to start their new journey, to our new adventure, which has already been richly rewarded.